Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Concert Recollections from an Aging Rock Fan, or what I can remember from the good old days after finding a box of my old tour programs from the 1970s and 1980s in the loft. I put an ebook together based on those programs, which is available for direct download, no opt in, no details required from the website, link in the description. And I'm turning it now into a series of videos and say that this is episode 2, and it deals with my musical epiphany all the way back in 1977. At that time, I was 15 years old. I was living in South Yorkshire here in the UK, and the closest major city was Sheffield. I wasn't interested much in music back then. Sport took up my spare time, at and after school and at weekends. And at that time, I was a pretty serious swimmer. I played cricket to a reasonable standard also. Well, until I gave up swimming when I lost the dedication needed to train twice a day. I did carry on playing cricket. Well, you had to be, being a Yorkshireman. It was tradition. You were born in Yorkshire as a Yorkshireman, and you played cricket. Cricket was a much bigger deal back then than it is now. My father hoped that I'd open for Yorkshire, but I wasn't that good. I didn't have that much talent as a batsman to make county level. Anyway, that's a digression, isn't it? On to the musical Epiphany. One day at school, a kid turned up with a bunch of albums under his arm. This kid wasn't anyone I had much to do with or anything to do with, really, though I was curious about those albums and the striking artwork. So I started to ask him about them. He certainly, from memory, had a copy of Rush's All the World's a Stage, and I think Uriah Heep's Firefly, Rick Wakeman's Journey to the Centre of the Earth, Alice Cooper's Billion Dollar Babies, and probably one or two others, but those are the ones that I'm pretty sure he had. As we spoke, this kid explained that these were rock music albums, suggesting if I thought I might like them, then try All the World's a Stage or Firefly to begin with. At that time, I had a paper round to boost up my pocket money. Having a paper round was something of a rite of passage back then, basically a form of child exploitation by the local newsagent shop. Get up at daft o'clock to walk around delivering newspapers to houses on your patch before school, and sometimes after school if there were enough evening editions, and the reward was a few meagre pounds for all that effort. I suppose it was like being a 1970s version of driving for Amazon, with walking around with a heavy bag of newspapers over one shoulder instead of driving a van. Newspaper delivery had a very high attrition rate. We delivery lads didn't last long before chucking it in when the early mornings and poor money was no longer considered worth the effort. And if it was cold, raining, or snowing, well, it was even more unpleasant. Now, maybe did you have a newspaper round as a kid? Can you remember back to those days? My newspaper delivery career was short, though the money did help augment my pocket money from my parents. And that paper round funded the purchase of my first rock music album, as on the next payday from the newsagent, I took the bus into Sheffield and I bought All the World's a Stage. I think it was about £3.50. Man, albums were cheap back then, right? On getting home with it, I asked my father if I could listen to it on his radiogram. Now, a radiogram was a rather large, crude cabinet-based piece of furniture which had a radio and a record player and speakers. Somewhat different to today's listening technology, right? Maybe you had a radiogram back in the day as well as a paper round. My father agreed I could listen to my shiny new record. However, neither he or I really knew what we were in for. The needle dropped on the opening riff to Bastille Day. That thundered out of the primitive speakers. I was instantly hooked and my musical epiphany complete. That's the moment I became a rock fan, in inverted commas. Not so much my parents, however, who both in unison shouted at me to turn that bloody racket down. And of course, I did as instructed, being a good lad. with the remainder of that first listening being at a much reduced volume. It did enthrall me straight away, that the power of Alex Lifeson's guitar, the intricate drumming of Neil Peart, Geddy Lee's banshee vocals, in particular that bombastic 2112. The following week I went into town again, this time to buy Caress of Steel, and my record buying addiction began to develop. An addiction I have to this day. I mean, you just can't have too many CDs, can you? My father wasn't too keen to let me use his radiogram too often, so I saved up some paper round money and did some extra chores around the house in return for extra pocket money, with the aim of buying myself a crude record player of my own, which I could use to listen in my bedroom. Again, record players back then were very crude things, very basic, though it did serve a purpose until I could gradually upgrade eventually to a proper record player with separate speakers and headphones, which was something of a game changer. Upgrading listening technology became financially much easier in the following year, in 1978, as then I became 16 years old, which was school leaving age, and I started work in a factory, earning a regular wage. However, that crude record player got me through for a while. I got some of my old friends into what I was listening to, and we formed a sort of a rock fans club between us, buying records, swapping them, and generally getting more and more into the scene. A big part of that was finding out about what was going on by reading the weekly rock music newspapers such as Sounds, Melody Maker, and the New Musical Express. Do you remember them? General rock music news, reviews, upcoming tours, and similar, all included. Reading plus word of mouth was how you found out what was going on in the 1970s. As it turned out, I read one of the weeklies that Rush were about to come over here for the first time for a short tour. One of those dates was in June 1977 at Sheffield City Hall, so quite convenient given that I lived a shortish bus ride away from Sheffield City Centre. Oh, and in addition to buying albums, recording off the radio or taking iffy recordings of records you borrowed from mates via cassette was a thing. Yes, cassettes, the most unfriendly of music formats. The trick was to position the microphone. Sorry, not the microphone. The trick was to position the machine next to the radio or record player, insert a cassette, then hit record and play, and hope for the best. Also hoping that you could ensure quietness and no interruptions. If you're of a certain age as I am, did you used to use your old crude cassette player to try and record stuff in that way? Getting all nostalgic. Well, that's the point of this video, I suppose, a bit of nostalgia. Anyway, forgive that slight diversion into cassettes. Back to finding out Rush were playing in Sheffield. A handful of us bought tickets, took the bus into town to attend what would be for all of us our very first rock concert. As half a decade's passed since, I can't remember too much about it. As I do recall, the City Hall was rather sparsely attended, and I think Rush had a carpet on stage, carpeted stage. The whole experience, however, was something of an eye-opener, well, and an ear-opener. The power of the music, the energy of the performance, the light show, and all the rest of it. Little did I know at that point I would go on to see Rush many, many times subsequently, but more on that in later videos. That Rush concert in 1977 completed my musical epiphany. I'd start to buy more and more albums and attend more and more concerts, particularly after starting work in 1978 and earning money. In a later video, I'll expand a little on some general concert recollections from back then, around the late 70s, early 1980s. Some of the early albums I bought were by the likes of Bebop Deluxe, Blue Oyster Cult, Hawkwind, UFO, Rick Wakeman, Uriah Heep, Yes, Budgie, Pink Floyd, Rainbow, Steve Hillage and whatnot. All bands and artists to which I still listen to regularly to this day, say 50 years later. Right, that's probably enough about my musical awakening, my musical epiphany, if you will, back in 1977. In the next video, episode 3, I'll move on to what it was like back then with the rock music scene and the emergence of what would be called the new wave of British heavy metal. So that will be episode 3. Okay, thanks for sticking through it. If you would like to, please do subscribe to this channel for more videos of my recollections, album reviews, and all the rest of it. And if you'd like the ebook of this, it is to say, it is available directly downloadable for free, no opt-in, no anything like that required, from newwaveofbritishheavymetal.com. Link in the description. All right, thanks again. See you later.